September 20th, 1944. Skies over Archival, France. Major Charles Carpenter flew his Piper L4 Grasshopper at 400 feet above the French countryside, the tiny fabric-covered observation plane bouncing in the morning turbulence. Below him, through the morning haze, he could see a German armored column moving along a rural road, tanks, armored cars, support vehicles, all advancing toward American positions near the town of Archival. In a conventional observation aircraft, Carpenter's role would be clear: observe the German column, note its position and composition, radio coordinates to American artillery, then get out of the area before German anti-aircraft fire found his slow, vulnerable aircraft. The L4 Grasshopper was a liaison and artillery observation plane, essentially a militarized version of the civilian Piper Cub. It was unarmed, slow, maximum speed 85 km/h, and had the defensive capabilities of a kite. Getting shot at in a Grasshopper was like being target practice. The plane couldn't outrun bullets, couldn't maneuver aggressively, couldn't fight back. Except that Charles Carpenter had decided his Grasshopper would fight back. Mounted on the wing struts of his L4, which he had nicknamed Rosie the Rocketer, were 6 M1 bazooka tubes, anti-tank rocket launchers that soldiers normally fired from their shoulders, but that Carpenter had jury-rigged to his aircraft using improvised mounting brackets welded together by helpful maintenance crews. The Army hadn't authorized this modification. Carpenter's commanding officers hadn't approved it. The manufacturer's specifications for the L4 certainly didn't include provisions for mounting anti-tank rockets, and military doctrine had no procedures for observation pilots attacking enemy armor with improvised weapons. But Charles Carpenter, who before the war had been a mild-mannered high school history teacher in Maplewood, New Jersey, had spent the past month proving that sometimes the best military doctrine is the one you invent yourself when you see a problem that needs solving. The problem Carpenter had identified was simple. Observation pilots like him located enemy armor frequently, called in artillery or airstrikes, then watched as various factors: bad communications, artillery already engaged elsewhere, fighter bombers on other missions, meant the enemy armor got away before being destroyed. German tanks and armored vehicles that could have been killed escaped to fight another day, to kill American soldiers, to extend the war. Carpenter's solution was equally simple. If he couldn't get someone else to kill the enemy armor he found, he would kill it himself. He would turn his observation plane into an improvised attack aircraft, would hunt German tanks from the air using weapons never designed for aerial deployment, and would do it in an airplane that had less armor protection than a canvas tent. The German tankers in the column below Carpenter had no idea what was about to happen. They were accustomed to American observation planes. The tiny Cubs flew over constantly, were annoying but harmless, just spotters that called in artillery. German crews had learned to watch for them and to disperse or take cover when they appeared, but the planes themselves weren't dangerous. That was about to change dramatically and permanently for this particular German column. Carpenter descended to 200 feet, throttled back to just above stalling speed, about 45 km/h, and aligned his approach with the road where the German column was stretched out. At this altitude and speed, he was vulnerable to any German with a rifle, let alone the machine guns that armored vehicles carried. But he needed to be low and slow to have any chance of hitting his target with the bazooka rockets. The firing mechanism for the bazookas was primitive. Carpenter had rigged electrical switches in his cockpit that completed circuits to fire the rockets. He had tested the system on practice ranges, had learned through trial and error what angles worked, what speeds were optimal, what ranges gave him the best chance of hitting. He had discovered that firing bazookas from a moving aircraft was nothing like firing them from the ground. The rockets didn't fly straight. They were affected by the aircraft's forward motion, by wind, by the angle of launch. Hitting a tank with a shoulder-fired bazooka from 50 yards on the ground was difficult. Hitting a tank with an aircraft-mounted bazooka from 200 feet while traveling at 45 mph was nearly impossible. Nearly impossible. But Carpenter had practiced, had developed an intuitive understanding of the angles and timing, had learned to compensate for variables that no gunnery manual addressed because no one had ever tried to do what he was doing. The lead vehicle in the German column was a Panzer IV tank, a 40-ton armored vehicle with a 75mm main gun capable of destroying any American tank. It was buttoned up, hatches closed, moving at perhaps 15 mph along the road. The crew was confident, secure in their armor, not expecting threat from the tiny observation plane overhead. Carpenter squeezed the trigger for the first pair of bazookas. The rockets ignited with a whoosh, leaped from the launch tubes, and streaked toward the German column trailing smoke. The first rocket missed, passing over the tank and exploding harmlessly in a field beyond. The second rocket struck the Panzer IV on the engine deck, not the ideal target point, but enough. The shape-charged warhead penetrated the thin rear armor, and the tank exploded as fuel and ammunition detonated. German soldiers in the column looked up in shock. A tank had just been destroyed by an observation plane? Impossible. But there was the burning Panzer, and there was the small aircraft overhead with smoke trails coming from tubes on its wings. Carpenter was already lining up his next shot. He fired the second pair of bazookas at an armored car behind the destroyed tank. One rocket missed. The other struck the armored car's side, penetrating and killing the crew. The vehicle rolled to a stop, blocking the road behind the burning Panzer. The German column was now in chaos. Crews were bailing out of vehicles, setting up machine guns, firing wildly at the aircraft overhead. Carpenter could hear bullets hitting his airplane, the distinctive pings of rounds striking metal parts, the ripping sound of bullets tearing through fabric covering. But the L-4 was still flying. Carpenter fired his third pair of bazookas at another tank in the column. One hit, one miss. The hit was good enough. Another Panzer IV exploded, adding to the chaos and carnage on the road below. Carpenter fired his final pair of rockets at a fourth tank, scored another hit, then climbed away as German fire intensified. He had fired all 6 bazookas in a single attack run, lasting approximately 40 seconds. 4 German armored vehicles were burning wrecks. The column was stopped, blocked by destroyed vehicles, under effective attack from a weapon system they had never encountered and didn't know how to defend against. Carpenter flew back to American lines, landed at his temporary airstrip, and inspected the damage to his aircraft. Over 20 bullet holes. The fabric covering was shredded in places. One strut had been grazed by a round that could have brought the plane down if it had hit a few inches differently. But Rosie the Rocketer was still flyable. Ground crew mechanics gathered around, examining the damage and congratulating Carpenter on his success. Word of what he had done spread quickly through the airfield and to the tank units Carpenter supported. The mild-mannered teacher from New Jersey, the observation pilot who wasn't supposed to be in combat at all, had just destroyed 4 German armored vehicles in a single attack using a weapon system he had improvised himself. Bazooka Charlie had just announced his presence to the German army in the most dramatic way possible. And over the following months, he would continue hunting German armor from his tiny fabric-covered plane, proving that innovation, courage, and creative thinking could turn a weapon system no one had imagined into an effective tank killer. This is the story of Charles Carpenter, the high school history teacher who became one of World War II's most unconventional warriors. The story of how he turned a defenseless observation plane into an attack aircraft through improvisation and determination. The story of a weapons system that shouldn't have worked but did, repeatedly, because one pilot refused to accept that his role was limited to observation. This is the story of Bazooka Charlie and Rosie the Rocketer, proof that sometimes the most effective solutions come not from military planners or weapons designers, but from individual soldiers who see problems and solve them, regardless of whether regulations or doctrine say their solutions are possible. To understand what Charles Carpenter accomplished, we need to understand who he was before the war, what the L-4 Grasshopper was designed for, and why mounting bazookas on observation planes was such an unlikely innovation. Charles Carpenter was born in 1912 in Pennsylvania. He grew up during the 1920s and 1930s, attended college, became a teacher. By 1941, he was teaching history at a high school in Maplewood, New Jersey, living a comfortable middle-class life as an educator. He was married, had a young son, and seemed headed for a quiet career, teaching American history to generations of high school students. When the United States entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, Carpenter was in his late 20s, married with a child. classifications that could have kept him out of military service or relegated him to non-combat roles. But Carpenter volunteered, joining the Army and applying for flight training. He was older than typical pilot candidates, didn't have the physical profile of a fighter pilot, and ended up assigned to liaison and observation duties. This was not the glamorous side of military aviation. Observation pilots flew slow, unarmed aircraft, did reconnaissance, spotted for artillery, carried messages, evacuated wounded from forward positions. It was dangerous work. Observation planes operated at low altitude over enemy territory, but it wasn't the kind of combat flying that generated headlines or medals. Carpenter was assigned to fly the L-4 Grasshopper, the military designation for a modified Piper J-3 Cub. The Cub was a simple, rugged civilian training aircraft that had been militarized for liaison duties. It had a 65-horsepower engine, maximum speed of 85 mph, could take off and land in incredibly short distances, and was easy to maintain under field conditions. The military L-4 version had minimal modifications from the civilian Cub: removal of the door for easier observation, installation of military radio equipment, and provision for carrying a wounded soldier on a litter strapped to the fuselage. There were no weapons, no armor, no defensive systems of any kind. The plane's only defense was its slow speed and maneuverability, which made it difficult for enemy fighters to engage effectively, and its ability to land in small spaces and hide quickly. Observation pilots like Carpenter operated from temporary airstrips close to front lines, grass fields, farm roads, any flat area long enough for the L-4's short takeoff and landing requirements. They would fly over German positions at low altitude, observe troop movements and fortifications, call in artillery fire, and return to their strips to refuel and report. The work was dangerous, but not glamorous. Observation pilots weren't aces shooting down enemy fighters. They weren't bomber pilots striking strategic targets. They were aerial scouts, doing necessary but unglamorous work that rarely resulted in recognition or awards. Carpenter arrived in France in August 1944, shortly after the D-Day invasion, and was assigned to the 4th Armored Division's artillery observation flights. His job was to fly over German positions, locate targets for American artillery, and direct fire. He did this job competently for several weeks, locating targets, calling in fire missions, helping American artillery destroy German positions. But Carpenter grew frustrated with the limitations of his role. He would locate German tanks or armored vehicles, call in artillery fire, then watch as communication delays, artillery engaged on other missions, or German movement meant the targets escaped. He was finding targets that needed to be killed immediately, but the system for killing them was too slow and unreliable. In early September 1944, Carpenter heard about experiments by other observation pilots who had mounted bazookas on their L-4s. The idea apparently originated with several pilots independently, all recognizing the same problem. They were finding targets, but couldn't kill them fast enough using conventional fire support. The bazooka was an American shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon, officially designated the M1 rocket launcher. It fired a shape-charged rocket designed to penetrate tank armor. Infantry soldiers carried bazookas and used them against enemy armor at close range. The weapon was effective, but required the infantryman to get close to the tank, expose himself to fire, and hit a moving, dangerous target. The concept of mounting bazookas on aircraft was logical in theory. Aircraft could get close to enemy armor more easily than infantry could attack from angles that armor was vulnerable, could escape quickly after firing. But making the concept work in practice required solving numerous technical problems. The L-4 wasn't designed to carry weapons. It had no mounting points for external stores, no fire control systems, no sighting equipment for targeting. Mounting bazookas required improvisation, welding brackets to attach the launcher tubes to wing struts, rigging electrical firing systems, developing methods for aiming without sights designed for the purpose. Several pilots in Carpenter's unit and other observation units experimented with these improvised mounting systems in September 1944. Some mounted 2 bazookas, some mounted 4, Trial and error revealed what worked and what didn't. Too many rockets affected the aircraft's flight characteristics. Mounting positions that seemed good on the ground proved impractical in flight. Firing systems that worked sometimes failed at critical moments. Carpenter, drawing on his training as a teacher who was accustomed to analyzing problems systematically, approached the bazooka mounting challenge methodically. He worked with maintenance crews to design mounting brackets that were secure but didn't affect the aircraft's balance. He experimented with different numbers of launchers and eventually settled on 6, 3 tubes mounted on each wing strut, arranged so their firing wouldn't destabilize the aircraft. He developed an electrical firing system that allowed him to fire the bazookas in pairs. Pressing a button in the cockpit completed a circuit that ignited the rocket motors. He couldn't fire all 6 simultaneously. That would have created too much asymmetric thrust if one side fired slightly before the other. But firing in pairs was manageable. Most importantly, Carpenter practiced. He convinced his commanders to authorize practice firing sessions where he could learn how to actually hit targets with rockets fired from a moving aircraft. This was entirely new. There was no manual, no training program, no experienced pilots who could teach him. He had to develop the technique himself through experimentation. He learned that he needed to be low, 200 to 300 feet, to have any accuracy. He learned that he needed to be slow, just above stalling speed, to give himself time to aim. He learned that the rockets didn't fly straight relative to the aircraft's heading, that he had to lead targets, that wind affected the rocket's trajectory significantly. He learned that firing bazookas from aircraft was extraordinarily dangerous. At 200 feet and 45 miles, he was an easy target for any German with a rifle. The L-4 had no armor. Bullets passed through the fabric covering without slowing. A hit to the engine, to a control cable, to Carpenter himself would mean a crash in enemy territory with no possibility of survival. But Carpenter also learned that it could work. With practice, he could hit tank-sized targets from 200 feet. The shape-charge warheads could penetrate tank armor from the top or rear, where armor was thinnest, and German tank crews weren't expecting attack from slow observation planes, which gave him a crucial advantage of surprise. By mid-September 1944, Carpenter felt ready to use his improvised weapon system in combat. The opportunity came during the Battle of Archival, a major tank engagement between American and German armored forces in eastern France. The Battle of Archival, which lasted from September 18th to October 1st, 1944, was one of the largest tank battles on the Western Front. German forces, attempting to counter the American advance toward the German border, committed significant armored forces to the Archival sector. American tank units, primarily from the 4th Armored Division, engaged German panzers in a series of running battles across the rolling countryside of eastern France. In this environment, Charles Carpenter found target-rich opportunities for his improvised tank-killing system. German armor was operating in the open, moving along roads, concentrating for attacks. Exactly the situations where a low-flying aircraft with anti-tank weapons could be most effective. After his successful attack on September 20th, which destroyed 4 German armored vehicles, Carpenter continued operations over the following days. He would fly reconnaissance missions, locate German armor, attack immediately rather than waiting for artillery or air support, then return to rearm and repeat. His typical attack profile became refined through practice. He would spot German armor from altitude, circle to assess the situation, and plan his attack approach, then descend to attack altitude, 200 to 300 feet, and reduce speed to just above stalling. He would make one attack pass, firing all 6 bazookas in 3 pairs, then climb away immediately before German defensive fire could be organized effectively. The limitation of his system was that each sortie only provided 6 shots. After firing all 6 bazookas, Carpenter had to return to base to reload. The launchers were reusable. Ground crews would remove the expended tubes, load new rockets, reconnect the electrical firing system, and send Carpenter back into action within an hour typically. This meant Carpenter flew multiple sorties per day during intense periods of the Archival battle. He would launch, fly to the battle area, locate targets, attack, return, rearm, and repeat. On some days, he flew 4 or 5 combat missions, each time exposing himself to German fire, each time risking his life in an aircraft that provided no protection. The cumulative stress was enormous. Every mission involved flying low over enemy positions, attacking dangerous targets, and accepting that any bullet could bring him down. The L-4 was hit repeatedly. Carpenter's aircraft accumulated dozens of bullet holes, had control cables shot through, took hits to the engine that somehow didn't disable it completely. Ground crews became adept at rapid repairs. They would patch bullet holes in the fabric covering, replace damaged control cables, fix whatever the Germans had shot up on the previous mission, reload the bazookas, and send Carpenter back into combat. Rosie the Rocketer was kept flying through maintenance work that would have grounded a less rugged aircraft. By late September 1944, German forces in the Archival sector had become aware of the threat from bazooka-armed observation planes. German intelligence reports began warning units to be alert for kleine Flugzeuge mit Panzerfaust, small aircraft with anti-tank rockets. German anti-aircraft crews were instructed to prioritize engaging L-4 aircraft, which had previously been considered low-priority targets. But shooting down a low-flying L-4 was difficult. The aircraft was small, slow, and maneuverable. It appeared suddenly, attacked quickly, and disappeared before effective defensive fire could be organized. German tank crews reported frustration at being unable to defend against these improvised aerial tank hunters. Moreover, the psychological impact was significant. German tank crews had been trained to fear American fighter bombers and artillery, but they could defend against these threats through established procedures: dispersion, camouflage, air defense coordination. But they had no procedures for defending against observation planes armed with bazookas. The threat was too new, too unconventional, and appeared too randomly for effective countermeasures. American ground forces loved Bazooka Charlie. Tank crews and infantry who saw Carpenter attack German armor cheered the little observation plane that was destroying enemy tanks. Word of his exploits spread through the 4th Armored Division and beyond. Soldiers would point out the L-4 with bazookas mounted on its wings, tell stories about the crazy observation pilot who hunted panzers. Stars and Stripes, the American military newspaper, published an article about Carpenter in October 1944. The article, titled "Bazooka Charlie and His Flying Tank Killer," described his improvised weapon system and his success attacking German armor. The story was picked up by civilian newspapers in the United States, giving Carpenter brief fame at home. Carpenter's reaction to this publicity was typically modest. In an interview included in the Stars and Stripes article, he downplayed the danger and emphasized the practical utility of what he was doing. "It's just another way to kill German tanks. We locate them anyway during observation missions. This way, we can attack immediately instead of waiting for artillery or fighter bombers that might not be available." When asked about the danger of flying a slow, unarmored aircraft at low altitude over enemy positions, Carpenter replied, "The L-4 is actually safer in some ways than fighters or bombers. We're too slow for German fighters to engage effectively. They overshoot us. We're too small and maneuverable to hit with flak. The danger is small arms fire, but if you attack fast and don't give them time to aim, your chances are good." This was optimistic assessment that minimized very real dangers. The bullet holes in Carpenter's aircraft testified that German soldiers were shooting at him plenty and hitting frequently. But Carpenter's point had merit. The L-4's characteristics did provide some protection through unpredictability and difficulty of engagement. By the end of the Battle of Archival in early October 1944, Carpenter had been credited with destroying 6 German tanks and several armored cars. Official confirmed kills based on ground verification of destroyed vehicles. The actual number was likely higher, as some vehicles Carpenter attacked were destroyed but not confirmed because they were in areas American forces didn't immediately occupy. 6 tanks might not sound like many compared to the hundreds destroyed by American tank units and fighter bombers during the same period. But Carpenter achieved this total while flying an aircraft never designed for combat, using improvised weapons, operating alone without support, in missions that were extraordinarily dangerous by any measure. Moreover, Carpenter's impact extended beyond the vehicles he personally destroyed. Other observation pilots, inspired by his example and success, began mounting bazookas on their L4s and conducting similar attacks. By late 1944, bazooka-armed observation planes were operating across the Western Front, attacking German armor and providing close air support to American ground forces. The tactic became common enough that the Army officially recognized it, provided guidance on mounting procedures and safety considerations, and included bazooka-armed L4s in tactical planning. What had started as Carpenter's improvised solution had become an accepted weapons system, though one that was never formally designated or integrated into doctrinal publications. The effectiveness of bazooka-armed L4s was limited by several factors. The rockets were not particularly accurate. Hitting a moving tank with a free-flight rocket fired from a moving aircraft required skill and luck. The shaped charge warheads were effective against tank armor, but only if they hit at appropriate angles. And the extreme danger to pilots meant that only the most aggressive and skilled observation pilots could effectively employ the tactic. But the limitations didn't negate the value. Every German tank destroyed by an observation pilot was one less tank for American ground forces to face. Every attack by a bazooka-armed L4 forced German armor to be more cautious, to disperse more widely, to dedicate resources to air defense that would otherwise be used offensively. Carpenter continued flying combat missions through the fall and winter of 1944-45 as American forces pushed toward Germany. He participated in operations during the Battle of the Bulge, the German surprise offensive in December 1944 that created crisis for Allied forces in the Ardennes. During the Bulge, Carpenter flew missions in terrible weather conditions: snow, fog, freezing temperatures. The L4 wasn't designed for winter operations. The open cockpit exposed pilots to brutal cold. Controls could freeze. Visibility was often near zero. But observation pilots flew anyway, because ground commanders needed their reports on German movements and needed their support attacking German armor. Carpenter's aircraft was hit multiple times during Bulge operations. On one mission, a German bullet struck his windscreen inches from his head, splintering the glass and showering him with fragments. He was cut and temporarily blinded, but maintained control of the aircraft and returned safely to base. After having glass fragments removed from his face and bandages applied, he flew another mission later the same day. This kind of determination, this refusal to be deterred by danger or injury, characterized Carpenter throughout his combat service. He accumulated over 400 combat flying hours between August 1944 and May 1945, flew hundreds of missions, was shot at constantly, and was hit by enemy fire repeatedly. But he kept flying, kept attacking, kept doing the job he had assigned himself of killing German tanks from his improvised aerial platform. By spring 1945, as Allied forces advanced into Germany itself, German resistance was collapsing. German armor was becoming scarce. Most panzers had been destroyed or had run out of fuel. Carpenter continued flying observation and liaison missions, but opportunities to attack armor became rare as the German army disintegrated. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Carpenter had completed his unlikely war. He had survived hundreds of missions in an aircraft that provided no protection, had destroyed multiple enemy tanks using weapons never intended for aerial use, and had helped prove that unconventional thinking and individual initiative could create effective solutions to tactical problems. Carpenter was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Medal with oak leaf clusters for his combat service. But the awards understated his accomplishments. The citations mentioned his observation work and his attacks on German armor, but they were routine language that didn't capture the extraordinary nature of what he had done, turning a defenseless observation plane into an effective tank killer through pure improvisation and determination. After the war, Carpenter returned to the United States and to civilian life. He resumed his teaching career, returning to the high school where he had taught before the war. He taught American history to students who had no idea their mild-mannered teacher was Bazooka Charlie, the pilot who had terrorized German tank crews from a fabric-covered observation plane. Carpenter rarely spoke about his wartime experiences. When students or colleagues asked about the war, he would deflect with generalities about serving as an observation pilot. He didn't mention the bazookas, the tank kills, the Stars and Stripes articles that had made him briefly famous. He simply returned to being a teacher, treating his extraordinary wartime service as something that had happened and was now over. This modesty was characteristic of many World War II veterans, who accomplished extraordinary things and then returned to ordinary lives without seeking recognition or dwelling on their wartime experiences. But it also meant that Carpenter's story gradually faded from public awareness. Without Carpenter himself publicizing it, without dramatic memoirs or media appearances, the story of Bazooka Charlie became a footnote in military aviation history rather than a celebrated legend. Carpenter died in 1966 at age 54, relatively young, possibly from health issues related to wartime stress and exposure. His obituary mentioned his wartime service but focused primarily on his teaching career. Most of his students, colleagues, and neighbors learned only after his death that their quiet neighbor had been one of World War II's most unconventional warriors. The legacy of Bazooka Charlie and the bazooka-armed L-4 grasshoppers is complex. From a military technology perspective, the system was a dead end. It was never formally adopted, never developed beyond improvised field modifications, and became obsolete as purpose-built attack aircraft and helicopters emerged after the war. But from a broader perspective, Carpenter's innovation was significant. He demonstrated several important principles that remain relevant. Field improvisation matters. Soldiers closest to problems often develop the most practical solutions. Carpenter saw a problem, German armor escaping before it could be destroyed, and developed a solution using available resources. His solution worked better than waiting for formal weapons development processes to address the problem. Unconventional weapons can be effective. The bazooka-armed L-4 was nobody's idea of an optimal anti-tank platform, but it was available, could be implemented quickly, and worked well enough to be tactically significant. Perfect solutions that take years to develop are less useful than good enough solutions available immediately. Psychological impact is real. The bazooka-armed L-4s were effective partly because they confused and demoralized enemy forces. German tank crews didn't know how to respond to threats that fell outside their tactical expectations. Creating confusion and uncertainty in enemy minds' military effect is real as destroying equipment. Individual initiative matters. Carpenter didn't wait for orders or authorization. He saw a need, developed a solution, demonstrated its effectiveness, and then it was adopted more widely. Military organizations that crush individual initiative sacrifice potential innovations that field-level personnel can provide. Simple is often better than complex. The bazooka-armed L-4 was crude, improvised, inelegant. But it worked. Complex weapon systems that require extensive development, training, and support are often less useful in actual combat than simple systems that soldiers can understand, maintain, and employ immediately. Modern military aviation includes attack helicopters and close air support aircraft that do what Carpenter's improvised system did: provide aerial support to ground forces against armored threats. These modern systems are far more capable than Carpenter's bazookas on an L-4, but the lineage is clear. The concept of lightweight aircraft providing direct fire support against ground targets traces back through various intermediate developments to World War II innovations, like Carpenter's improvised tank killer. The U.S. Army's development of armed helicopters in the Vietnam War era owed something to World War II experiences with armed observation aircraft. The idea that slow, maneuverable aircraft could effectively attack ground targets with direct-fire weapons was proven by pilots like Carpenter, even though the specific aircraft and weapons evolved. The story of Bazooka Charlie also provides perspective on what makes military heroes. Carpenter was not a fighter ace shooting down dozens of enemy aircraft. He was not a bomber pilot striking strategic targets. He was an observation pilot who improvised a solution to a tactical problem and executed that solution with extraordinary courage. His heroism was in doing a job that needed doing despite extreme danger, despite using equipment never intended for the purpose, despite lack of formal authorization or support. This kind of quiet, determined heroism, doing what needs to be done regardless of obstacles, is less dramatic than ace pilots or commando raids, but is equally important to military success. The fact that Carpenter returned to teaching after the war, that he didn't seek fame or recognition, that he treated his extraordinary wartime service as simply doing his duty. This makes his story more rather than less impressive. He wasn't performing for recognition or glory. He was solving a problem he had identified, using skills and creativity he possessed, and then returning to normal life when the war ended. For Carpenter's students after the war, those who eventually learned their teacher was Bazooka Charlie must have gained new perspective on the quiet man teaching them American history. The lesson wasn't just about historical facts, but about character. That extraordinary capability can exist in ordinary-seeming people, that heroes don't always announce themselves, that the teacher grading your papers might have spent a year attacking German panzers from a fabric-covered airplane held together with patches and determination. Today, Carpenter's L4. Rosie the Rocketer no longer exists. It was likely scrapped after the war like most wartime L4s. But photographs survive, showing the little observation plane with its improvised bazooka mounts, looking like exactly what it was. A civilian trainer transformed into an unlikely weapon of war through necessity and ingenuity. Military museums occasionally include displays about bazooka-armed L4s, explaining the concept and noting Carpenter as the most successful pilot to employ the tactic. Aviation historians include Carpenter's story in books about World War II aviation, usually in sections on unconventional or improvised aircraft modifications. But Carpenter remains underappreciated compared to more conventional heroes. He doesn't have the name recognition of fighter aces or famous bomber pilots. There are no major films about Bazooka Charlie. His story is told primarily in specialized military history circles rather than in mainstream popular culture. This relative obscurity is undeserved but understandable. Carpenter's story doesn't fit neat categories. He wasn't a fighter pilot, wasn't a bomber crew member, wasn't a ground soldier. He was an observation pilot who improvised an attack capability that shouldn't have worked but did. That's harder to explain than ace pilot shot down 30 enemy aircraft, or bomber crew completed 25 missions over Germany. Moreover, Carpenter himself didn't promote his own story. He didn't write memoirs, didn't give numerous interviews, didn't leverage his wartime fame into post-war recognition. He simply went back to teaching and lived quietly until his death at 54. But for those who know his Bazooka story, Charles Carpenter stands as an example of several virtues that military service requires but doesn't always recognize adequately. Creativity under pressure. Carpenter didn't just identify a problem. He developed a practical solution using available resources and his own technical skills. Personal courage sustained over time. One heroic action is impressive. Carpenter flew hundreds of dangerous missions over 9 months, each time exposing himself to fire that could kill him. Each time accepting danger as the price of effectiveness. Humility about accomplishment. Carpenter never sought glory or recognition. He did his job, did it well, and moved on with life. This kind of quiet professionalism is admirable, but often goes unrecognized. Practical focus on mission. Carpenter didn't care about fame or awards. He cared about killing German tanks before they could kill American soldiers. This mission focus, this prioritization of results over recognition, is fundamental to military effectiveness. Adaptability. Carpenter was a history teacher who became a pilot who became a tank killer. He adapted to circumstances, learned new skills, developed innovative solutions. This kind of adaptability is essential in warfare where circumstances change constantly. Charles Bazooka Charlie Carpenter was a high school history teacher from New Jersey who flew a fabric-covered observation plane, mounted bazookas on the wings through improvised engineering, and spent 9 months attacking German tanks at extreme personal risk. He destroyed at least 6 tanks officially and probably more unofficially. He helped prove that improvised solutions could be effective, that individual initiative mattered, and that courage expressed through sustained performance of dangerous duty was as heroic as dramatic one-time actions. He received some recognition during the war, then returned to teaching, and lived quietly until his early death. His story was largely forgotten except by military aviation enthusiasts and historians who study unconventional weapons and tactics. But his legacy is real. Every time a helicopter provides close air support to ground forces, Every time soldiers improvised solutions to tactical problems their training didn't address. Every time an individual's creativity and courage solve problems that formal systems can't. That's Charles Carpenter's legacy being lived out. The teacher who became Bazooka Charlie, who turned a defenseless observer plane into a tank killer, who terrified German armored crews from an aircraft that could barely outrun a car, who survived hundreds of missions that should have killed him, and who then went back to teaching American history to teenagers who had no idea the quiet man at the front of the classroom was a legitimate war hero. That's the story of Charles Carpenter, underappreciated but extraordinary, quiet but courageous. A footnote in aviation history who should be a chapter, a forgotten hero whose innovation and determination saved American lives and proved that sometimes the best solutions come from field-level improvisation rather than formal weapons development. Bazooka Charlie, the major who turned a Piper Cub into a tank buster, the teacher who went to war and rewrote the rules of aerial combat, the observation pilot who refused to just observe and instead attacked again until the war was won and he could go home to the classroom where he belonged. His story deserves to be remembered not just as an amusing anecdote about improvised weapons, but as an example of what individuals can accomplish when necessity, creativity, and courage combine to solve problems that formal systems can't address. The little observation plane with 6 bazookas strapped to its wings was nobody's idea of a proper weapon system. But it worked. It killed German tanks, and it demonstrated that sometimes the most effective innovations come from the most unlikely sources. Charles Carpenter proved that. Proved it with fabric and steel, with improvised rockets and extraordinary courage, with hundreds of missions that brought him close to death, but that he flew anyway because American soldiers on the ground needed German tanks destroyed and Carpenter had figured out how to destroy them. That's Bazooka Charlie's legacy, and it deserves to be remembered, celebrated, and taught as an example of American ingenuity, courage, and determination, the quiet teacher who became a terror to German panzers, who survived the impossible, and who then returned to teaching history as if attacking tanks from a Piper Cub with jury-rigged bazookas was just something everyone did during the war. It wasn't. It was extraordinary. And Charles Carpenter was extraordinary, even though he would never have said so himself. The story speaks for itself. The man who turned a defenseless plane into a tank killer and changed military aviation history through pure improvisation and sustained courage under fire.